Legal presents The Realty Debate with Manisha Natarajan, powered by Reliance Home Finance.
Welcome everyone to The Realty Debate. We are focusing on affordable housing. This is actually second of our four-part series. And our focus today is on land. Do we have land to make affordable houses? Where they really need it is the question. Also for long, developers have been saying, well, land is cheap, enough to build low-cost housing, there really is no demand. And where there is demand, there is no land, or land is so expensive, it's really not viable to make affordable homes. How do we solve this puzzle? Joining me today are Sandeep Singh, CEO Sheltrix Developer. Sandeep, thank you very much for being here. Also with us, Rahul Sabharwal, COO VBHC. They are big players in the affordable housing segment. Rahul, thanks for making the time. Arun Mishra, former Housing Secretary, who has the inside knowledge of just the policy making part and what really happens on the affordable housing front. Vikram Jain, Director FSG Inclusive Marketing. Vikram, thanks for joining me. I know the in-depth work that your company and you personally have done on affordable housing. Before I go to my panel, here are some of the key challenges around land for affordable housing. Now, first of all, what is it? It's lack of availability of urban land. Is it really so? Also, we know that there is excessive control on development of land, which does create artificial shortage. Then there are lack of marketable land parcels. Titling issues, who really owns that land is another one which becomes a bottleneck. Land records not yet digitized in majority of the states. And finally, there's hardly any mapping being done to know what is the available land inventory. So with my panel, I'm going to start with the first big challenge. Is there really a lack of availability of urban land? Mr. Mishra, let's start with you. I mean, in your policy making all those years when you've looked at affordable housing, do you really feel that in cities of India, there's scarcity of land?
You see, let's understand it very clearly. It's not only in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas, there is going to be a shortage of land. We have to understand that land is going to be a scarce commodity. So if that is the case, then what is the way, how do we optimize its particular use? So there are two ways in which it can be done. One, of course, is whenever there is a need for land acquisition, we have to be a little more liberal. We have to be a little more compassionate toward the farmers from whom we get the land. And second, whatever land we are able to get or whatever land we already have, we must optimize its use. Change the building regulations in such a manner that more and more units we're able to set up in that particular parcel of land, which basically means that change the development control norms, allow higher FSI, allow higher density. If these two things are put together, I personally feel that there won't be any shortage of any land anywhere, whether in the urban areas or in the rural areas.
All right. Vikram, do you believe that Mr. Mishra has actually summed it all up? I mean, is there an availability problem at all, or is it really the development control rules which create this artificial scarcity of land?
Mishra ji has put it very well. I would just add a little bit to it, saying actually what we are talking about is service land, because frankly housing can only come up on service land. So is there really a shortage of land? Answer is no. Is there a shortage of service land? Perhaps, but I think there are a lot of means, like Mishra ji mentioned, relaxing some of the norms, also just improving the urban infrastructure. I mean, you can build out roads, you can build out metros, etc., and a lot more land becomes accessible where people can stay. So from a government perspective, there's policy intervention, there's also like rolling out of infrastructure which can really add to the land supply. So short answer, no.
Okay. Sandeep saying lack of availability of urban land, is that the biggest challenge you face while building affordable homes? What's your biggest challenge when it comes to land?
Land is a bit of a challenge, that is correct. I think, personally for Sheltrix, it's not so much of a challenge. We focus on large land parcels that are connected with good transportation. But the problem at a national level is twofold. There is there's no scarcity of land, but there's scarcity of zoned land. So I think as a country, we have not done really well in terms of our performance for urban planning. And that is where the zoning has not come in at the right time when needed, because this planning needs to come in years ahead, maybe a decade ahead of when the demand really comes in. And there, not only we have failed to give it ahead of time, we have actually, so 2001 to 2010 was the fastest decade in the economic history of this country. And some of the larger cities were without a master plan at that point in time. So, I think that is the most unfortunate part. The second point is the transport connectivity. So, as long as the infrastructure is built, and that doesn't need too much of land to be acquired. These are, thin strips of land which connect the major cities. As long as that infrastructure gets built, then there is enough supply of land.
Okay. So, all right, now that is a chicken and an egg situation in India. Rahul Sabarwal, we're just discussing some of the key challenges. And I think the big question that I've posed to all here on my panel is there actually a scarcity of land in urban India? The panelists so far have said really no scarcity if you allow for transportation, great infrastructure and change in development norms. Would you agree, disagree or have a different point of view?
So, I've been hearing Manisha, some of the panelists. My view or our view of the business is as follows. Most of affordable housing is going to be developed in peri-urban areas. Essentially, peri-urban areas means we have a slight amount of connectivity to the city, but a lot of them are remote areas. Connectivity to these areas and infrastructure, government infrastructure is almost zero. So it's almost like building, in the wilderness. And the infrastructure normally follows once you start delivering a project. The second issue with most of peri-urban India, some of the panelists earlier mentioned, is that a lot of them are agriculture aggregated lands. Now, this agriculture aggregated lands, a lot of the land surveys were done during the British time. India has not had a proper survey done maybe for the last 60, 70, 80 years. So a lot of this is, is on pieces of paper, pieces of, cloth, and just trying to aggregate land while land is available. Aggregating that land into one parcel to make it a large project becomes a challenge. The second challenge that you come across is what was mentioned earlier as well, is essentially the lack of FSI. So a lot of peri-urban areas, have a lack of FSI whereby once you've aggregated land, the best you can do is probably 0.75 to 1 or 1.2, and that is where the land becomes a constraint. So while I agree with the panelists that there is a lot of land available, but there is also a shortage of land in some sense because of certain things that could be developed and improved upon within the country, and that will help us, really get more and more land available, especially for areas like affordable housing where there is a constraint on the selling price, there is a constraint on what the customer wants to pay.
Right. So, Mishra, these are some of the problems that you would, when you were in the ministry, have recognized, isn't it? Why is it that things haven't really changed on ground? I mean, let's start with titling issues, right? Which is something two of our panelists have mentioned, that who really owns the land, aggregating it becomes so difficult, land records are not yet digitized in majority of the states. Isn't there a big recognition of this fact and the fact that they must get recognized? What's the progress and where are we moving on that front?
Before you go to the titling part, let me make it a little clear.
Okay.
Some of the panelists may not agree with me. The region that we went to the peri-urban areas in the decade that was mentioned between 2001 to 2010 was because it was the easier option. Rather than getting into the urban area, trying small parcels of land and try to build it up, which incidentally Delhi did to a large extent, in the sense you had a lot of housing, individual housing coming up inside Delhi.
So you're saying that the reason why peri-urban areas got developed was because it was harder to build in the cities?
It was much harder to build in the cities,
okay.
And then land was available, and other than a few places in the country, in most of the areas, in the rural areas at least, the land titlings was not a major issue. Land titling, of course, is a major issue in the urban areas. It becomes a major issue, particularly with about 25% of the total land mass being under the slums, it becomes a major issue. But in the rural areas, by and large, the land titling was not a major issue, so people thought they will get cheap land, they will build many houses, and people will automatically go and buy them. That's why you had thousands and thousands of houses coming up in the peri-urban areas. So it's not that the development was, there was a need for the development in those areas, but we did it because it is easy for us. But now we have realized that while it is easy to build those houses, it's much more difficult to push the people to that particular area, because yes, infrastructure is a problem. People will like to be close to the area that they want to work. They can't possibly travel every day 35-40 kilometers, particularly when most of them are not very high income category people. Their incomes are limited.
Right.
So that's why it's not getting sold. So now the effort will have to be to develop whatever, what you call the downtown areas we have, or inside the city areas. And there the densities will have to be changed. One person spoke about the zonal plans. The zonal plans will have to be revisited. For instance, when we were doing a survey in Bombay, we realized that 40% of the total housing in Bombay is in less than 100 square feet area.
Wow.
The average 40% of the houses were of less than 10 square meters.
Okay.
Same in Delhi, the densities here are slums areas goes up to 1250, 1300. So the development control norms will have to be changed. You have to bring in the people who are already there. That is true both in the urban areas and also in the rural areas.
Okay. All right. Vikram Jain, do you believe that anybody who's taken on to affordable housing project has actually opted out for the easier solution, that is aggregate land in peri-urban areas?
If you're talking about housing, and again, let's define what we call low income housing as housing under 12 lakh rupees. So for that price point, you would have to go into peri-urban areas. A lot of the housing around this comes around on the outskirts of the city. I would emphasize most of this is though still connected to the city reasonably well. Again, if we exclude the big metros, because they tend to hog the discussion a lot, but if you go to Indore, you go to Ahmedabad, you go to some of the other cities, this could be as simply about 12-15 kilometers from the city center, which is perfectly fine because the person necessarily does not always come to the city center to work. So I feel yes, it's easier to build on the outskirts of the city. There is a demand from customers to buy housing in the outskirts of the city. So I think the developers who are doing this at the price points of 12 lakhs, 15 lakhs are really serving the customers who are needy of these.
Okay.
So,
Sandeep Singh, would you agree that if you have to build houses of 15 lakh and below ticket size, building them within city limits in any big city and tier 2 city of India is not possible? You will have to step out to peri-urban areas.
Absolutely. We are already building houses at 11 lakhs, 12 lakhs to 15 lakhs and a little bit more price points as well. But we are really far out in the peripheral areas. And what I was mentioning earlier that about urban planning, the fact that we are lagging behind. So right now there's a disconnect between what is city limit and where do you find the next properly zoned land, how far outside. So there is a gap. When I mentioned about urban planning, it has to be a continuous growth of the city boundaries. So we can't have area like MMR all around Mumbai where 85% of it is non-urbanizable.
Right.
In fact, when you get outside of MMR, then you can find, those are free sale zones and where there you can get one FSI on any land. But closer to the city, it is restricted. Similarly, in case of Delhi, only before 2011, when the draft master plan came, only about 50% of the state of Delhi was urbanized. But the development went out to the outside of state, which is Gurgaon and other places, because the master plans had not come in for the remaining 50% which could have been urbanized. Now that thing is happening.
Rahul Sabharwal, I would totally agree with it. The huge issue of affordable housing is also a big problem related to just not having master plans for most of India's cities, isn't it? Zoning has been missing. Even today, if you look at it, master plans are created and they're open for discussion. There are so many views and they go again under the radar. Who really is working on master plans and zoning in this country?
Basically, I agree with the panelist. There is a issue, especially when you go out of town, like I mentioned before, customers are willing to pay a certain price point for the property, and you need a clear title land with zoning in peri-urban areas, to start building and delivering affordable housing. You know, one of the panelists earlier mentioned that most developers chose the easy way out to move, from the center of the city or what have you to peri-urban areas to build because of, the challenge, I would say, building in a city which has a master plan to a certain extent is always lesser than trying to go to a peri-urban area and actually build. In a peri-urban area, you are probably in certain cities or tier 2 towns, you are the first large player coming in. There is a lot of experimentation which happens at a ground level where people are trying to figure out how to take a large, large development in a particular area where nobody else has done it. So at that point of time, it becomes difficult if there is no planning. And so it's not an easier solution, but if you want to provide mass housing for customers in the price points that we mentioned, which is, say 10 to 20 lakhs, then we don't have an option to do it in city limits. It has to be outside of city limits.
Okay. Mr. Mishra, would you agree that there is a lot of merit to this argument that hardly any mapping is being done to know where really available land inventory is, and that's also a big challenge when it comes to affordable housing? I mean, I've got some figures which say that you actually need about 1,20,000 hectares of additional land to be able to build houses for EWS and LIG.
There is no denying the fact that the planning process in this country, particularly the urban planning, has been rather deficient. We really need to strengthen it, whether we have a development authority or the municipality corporation or a regional planning body. They really need to make it a continuous effort. That goes without saying. But inside, most of the people say that it's impossible to build a house and deliver a house between 15 to 20 lakh rupees inside the urban city areas. We also recognize that. That's why we said that whenever you develop a particular part, at least 15% of the FSI you should earmark for the EWS and the LIG category.
But that's not happening. Despite the norms, people are flouting those norms, isn't it? That's also another big problem.
That's the problem. The problem is of enforcement.
Let's go on. So we've looked at some of the problems, but there are some successful models. At least at state level, there is a lot of intervention. State governments are waking up to the fact that affordable housing is going to bring them back to power. It's a big political ticket. So let's look at what UP has done. A state which needs a lot of affordable housing. They launched Samajwadi Awas Yojana in 2014. That was UP Housing and Development Board reduced land rates to make the project viable. Now, instead of paying 1.5 times the land rate, builder has to pay just the land rate. That's a big one. You actually just have to pay the land rate. UP government is likely to also give rebate in stamp duty. That's another thing that they've done to encourage. Ghaziabad Development Authority, GDA, changed land use in 2 villages from agricultural to residential and also acquired land to be handed over to 2 private developers to build affordable houses. UP government has said that they will construct 3 lakh affordable houses this year. There's lots happening on Rajasthan. In fact, that's one state which has been winning a lot of awards when it comes to affordable housing. They have different models drafted with different land ownership options, double the permissible FAR. So just making more buildable, let's say buildable area is, I think, a big one to make affordable housing possible. And also TDR facility, that is transferable development rights. It waived off external development charges, building plan approval fees and land conversion. So tons of things which the Rajasthan government has done. Gujarat has amended the Land Acquisition Act, done away with social impact assessment for affordable housing projects, also done away with 70% consent of affected parties for social projects. These are some very, very bold steps. Vikram, won't you agree? I mean, to really actually taking the bull by its horn and saying, look, if I'm going to give affordable housing, I have the moral right to go ahead and acquire land without falling under the parameters of land acquisition. Do you think it's a bold step which should be followed by other states as well?
So mixed views. I think the Rajasthan model has definitely worked well. We have seen a lot of housing coming up. I feel right now the traction on that policy is, at least from on the ground, what we are hearing is not huge. I think the TDR part has come into question, which means that it's no longer as attractive to the developer as it used to be. Again, this may have changed. So some of these are good, but I think from the developer's perspective, what they are really looking for is faster approvals. I think the developers are willing to buy the land at market prices. The developers are keen to buy land at market prices. As long as they get faster approvals and they are able to get on with their business of making homes and providing homes, I think developers in the low income segment have a sustainable model. So really from my perspective, I think rather than trying to artificially reduce the price of land and then who knows where that land ends up and who buys that land and who doesn't, why doesn't the state go on for a blanket? If you're going to come up with affordable houses, we'll give you approvals within 90 days.
Sandeep Singh, very quickly, if you had a wish list and you would want 2 or 3 things for the government, for the states that you're working with to do, what would it be? Single window clearance, of course, is a sitting duck. It's a no-brainer. Everybody should be doing it.
Absolutely. I think single window clearance is number 1. Number 2, as Vikram rightly said, the provision for affordable housing should not be like a forced thing where you make this land only for affordable housing, because then it leads to eventual wrong usage. It should be more economically driven where there is enough supply of zoned land so that the prices of land anyway fall to a reasonable level, where the seller of the land and the buyer of the land, which are developers, they are both agreeable at a certain price, and they are creating value not just by purchase of land at a cheap price, but they are creating value by putting on the right sort of infrastructure or the right sort of facilities in an integrated development, so that people are actually able to go to the schools nearby, they go to the hospitals nearby. So another main thing which we need is transport connectivity. So until unless at an urban planning level, cities are like living organisms, right? And any part of the organism will not survive until unless there is a blood supply to it, and that is the transport connectivity. So the roads that reach to that part, the train connectivity that reach to that part, even the metro if possible. So once that is provided, all of those areas will flourish.
So you're saying zoning and you've added transportation. Rahul Sabharwal, what's on your wish list? I mean, for VBHC, it's been a very, very difficult journey. Many pluses, many negatives, and it's not been easy. I mean, your promoters have always said this has been a very challenging journey.
One of the biggest challenges that we've encountered in the last 5-6 years is the multiple agencies within the government in a particular area have different set of approvals. So what we've been advocating is that we look at a similar one set of approvals, number 1, which are not contrary with each other, and also look at approvals which are probably redundant today. I mean, there are cities that require you to get BSNL approval. I mean, just as an example, case in point, right? How many people today use a BSNL phone line? So just consolidating approval, getting a single window approval, and making sure that they are not in conflict with each other.
Okay.
And also looking at local infrastructure development, and even when you are opening up new areas, new cities are being built, new smart cities are being built. Have a plan in mind, at least a tentative plan in mind, while the execution may take a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, depending on the scale, but have a plan in mind which is ready, so that developers can come and help.
I think we've heard everybody. Mr. Mishra, we've also on the single window clearance, we've had Housing Minister just come out with a big announcement that we are going to implement single window clearance at least in Delhi. Mumbai has also decided to do it. But if you were to look at the rollout in different states, how hopeful are you that this will happen and this will happen sooner than later?
You see, the Affordable Housing Task Force has very clearly mentioned what are the steps that needs to be taken. But most of this will have to be done at the state level and some at the municipality level, some of course at the central government level. So what is very important now and what is absolutely necessary, that the central government must engage with the state governments to get these things implemented. Secondly, regarding the single window clearance, I remember distinctly when I left the ministry, that was about 2 years ago. Even at that time, almost about 45 towns in the country, medium towns, they've been able to build up a system in which they will give some kind of a single window clearance, which related to the state level permissions, not central government level permissions. So that is something which goes without saying. Now you have also mentioned Government of India is also coordinating with the various central government ministries. That's a very important part. But along with the single window clearance, the other things will also have to be done simultaneously. If you do it sequentially, of course, the benefits are not optimized. And for housing as a whole, I think all these things will have to be engaged simultaneously, and then only maybe this will actually take off.
Otherwise, it's just going to remain a mission. I mean, 2 years down, this government, lofty mission, but so right now seeming very, very far from reality. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Sandeep Singh, Rahul Sabarwal, Arun Mishra, Vikram Jain, thank you for taking time out. We will continue with this series because it's not a small question, it's a large problem to solve. Several pieces need to come together. And when you talk about roti, kapda and makan is so critical for dignity of life that we have to keep focusing on it. Stay with us. When we come back, we will take a look at some of the key tier 2 cities of North India to see how they're holding up in this real estate downturn.